In this video reading of a biography of ordinary man, what I'm doing is reading and discussing the book, and at the same time thinking it forwards, thinking it onwards. This is in line with what Laruelle did when he wrote it, and what he invites us to do, to situate ourselves on. He's inviting us to situate ourselves on the transcendental plane, on the noetic plane, and to think and rethink what he's saying and the object of what he's saying or pointing at. So this is important because we have to avoid possible traps. There may be a trap in reading Laruelle. There may be a form of magical thought that is going on despite his intention of creating a new science, a science of ordinary man. But there's no guarantee that we can take everything he says for granted, that there's no danger of falling under his spell in reading the book or in certain parts of the book, that some sort of transcendental monster could crop up and keep us prisoner. So we have to keep thinking at the same time that we're reading, and we have to keep noetizing, and that's part of what Laruelle wants, and as part of the message of what he's saying. So this transcendental plane he calls the one from the forward. He calls it man, individuals, the one, or authorities. So, and I said from the beginning that another synonym is the absolute. And he says very quickly he's talking about a transcendental science. So this already brings up a big question. In what sense can we say, and can we justify saying, that man, as Laruelle defines or describes the concept, that man is identical with the whole of the transcendental plane? That's a pretty big assumption. So if we say that the transcendental plane cannot exist without man, yet at the same time transcendentally is prior to man as a concept within the world and the worlds that we know, talking about familiar common sense knowledge and the knowledge of the human sciences and the knowledge in quotation marks that philosophy may give us. We're saying that this authoritarianly defined man is not just a construct, but not just something that comes after in terms of the transcendental plane, but is in a certain sense hallucination. So a consequence of that is that we're not human, and doubly so in terms of the definitions within the grand paradigm of Greco-philosophical thought that goes back 2,500 years, the various definitions of man, these are without consistence, without coherence, and without ultimately without validity. That's what we were seeing in Laruelle's critique of the human sciences. On the other hand, the ordinary man is not something that we just are just like that, as we ordinarily think and act and talk and feel about ourselves. So, in a certain sense, that's a future project, even if from the transcendental point of view, that's what we are already. So, from Laruelle's point of view, we're not human. So anybody who reads Laruelle, that's one of the traps. If you read Laruelle and because you're in some sort of minority and you think, yes, I'm in revolt against the authorities, maybe I'm young, I have some sort of minority, political or sexual or psychological or artistic practice or mode of life, that's not what he's talking about at all. He's not throwing all that away. He thinks there's something transcendental inside those relative minorities, but that's not what he's talking about at all. So if you think, oh, I can identify with what Laruelle is talking about because of my minority situation or identity, you're still inside the cavern that Laruelle talks about, that has lasted for 2,500 years. So you can't be proud of your identities, you can't be proud of your intensities in the ordinary sense of intensities. All that has to be noetized, and then the question of pride and aggressivity doesn't even come up. So that's the self-critique he addresses himself in the foreword, that he occasionally lapses into anti-philosophical vivacity. There are occasional autobiographical moments concerning frustrated passion or disappointed passion, concerning institutional indignity, and he's done his best to noetize, to sublimate them, and that's the way to go. He's saying, and that's in consonance with already with anti-Oedipus, don't personalize, don't familiarize, don't Oedipalize, but noetize. And that means that he's either as well breaking with anti-Oedipus is not going far enough. He talks about rupture in the foreword as well. Or protecting anti-Oedipus by saying that we mustn't have this relative identity of minorities' point of view on anti-Oedipus. It looks like it's talking about that, but you must read anti-Oedipus in the light of logic of sense and its transcendental field. So, and even then, logic of sense doesn't go far enough, but he's bringing the so-called desiring machines. I say so-called because Deleuze and Guattari quickly dropped that terminology. He's trying to lift the so-called desiring machines to the noetic level, and ultimately that means for Deleuze and Guattari, as for him, you're going to have to drop the term desire. That's an anthropo-logical predicate, if ever there was one. And you're going to have to drop the term machine, because that's the inhuman version of the anthropo-logical predicates that have dominated us as authoritarian universals for 2,500 years. So that's what he's trying to do, and you shouldn't drag him back to the empirical level. But, well, maybe I'll anchor this a bit more in the text, but you're not to abandon your experience properly conceived either, but you're meant to be constantly noetizing, thinking, rethinking everything, including what he's saying. So the conclusion is, as I said, that we're not even human yet. He will later, I'm looking at pages 4 and 5, and maybe a little further, he'll go on to say that what we are within the terms of the authoritarian universals are quasi-transcendental androids, quasi-transcendental anthropoids. They're quasi-transcendental because they're not really transcendental. They're the best that philosophy can approach as a transcendental level. He says androids and anthropoids, giving examples of the cogito, the spirit, workers, the unconscious. So even Marxism and psychoanalysis don't go far enough. I say even because in the French tradition they're supposed to be pretty high up in the transcendental hierarchy, but they don't go far enough. They're producing androids instead of a concept of the human. They're producing, it's not just conceptual, that's what we are. We're a mess for Laruelle. We're full of anthropo-logical predicates, and that's how we understand ourselves. It's not just in the human sciences, it's not just in philosophy, it's in us when we read the book, and maybe probably it's in the book itself. Laruelle is trying for the greatest purity he can achieve in this book, but he will go on from there anyhow. On page 4, we looked at his question of how is a science, a rigorous science of man, possible. And in the bottom paragraph that fills up a little more than half of the page, he continues his own form of ideological critique in talking about the idea that the concept of man is an indeterminate concept in its origin and in the Greco-unitary philosophical presuppositions that serve as its foundation. So he's trying to put us constantly through, again and again, the crisis of foundations to get us out of the Greco-unitary philosophical cavern. The essence of man is understood in the anthropo-logical forms of philosophy and of its avatars, the human sciences, and all we get is a phantasmatic projection of Greco-Christian ontological prejudices onto real man. So there's this projection onto the real man. We're still in the Lacanian, if you will, imaginary, even though we think we're doing science or rigorous philosophy. So philosophy has been unable to see man. So he's putting in this part a lot of weight on one of the synonyms or quasi-synonyms for the transcendental field. So this is something that is not fully justified so far. We can say he justifies it because he starts from there. But in fact, starting from there, he's starting from the one, the absolute, the transcendental. So there's no justification given that all these quasi-synonymous concepts must be exactly coextensive. But at least for Laruelle, the idea of man and of the human as adjective is of the essence of what he's doing. So he talks about Greco-ontological thought with the related bastard sciences that make up its entourage, like so many shameful cadavers. I would like to put a little parenthesis concerning the translation. I don't like the word, I'm not satisfied with the word related bastard sciences. In the text it says, in French, ces sciences annexes et bâtardes. So they're annexes, they're auxiliary sciences, in fact. And they're not just related, but they're of subordinate importance. They're sort of supplements at the back of the book of the text of Greco-ontological thought. The related bastard sciences that make up its entourage, like so many shameful cadavers. You can go along with the flow there if you want, but that's one of the things that Laruelle says we do too much. Later on he'll talk about, still in the same paragraph, at the end of this paragraph, which is on page 5, he'll say at the end of the paragraph that we're in Greco-unitary thought, we're still stuck in originary theoretical carelessness, and in the French, it's a little more, I don't know if it's stronger, but it's a little more specific. I like carelessness, but it's laisser-aller, letting oneself go with whatever, with what's happening, or with the flow, or with the reigning set of ideas. So back to this sentence. Greco-ontological thought with the related bastard sciences that make up its entourage, like so many shameful cadavers. So we shouldn't just sort of go with the flow there. What's shameful? In a certain sense, you can say the cadavers are shameful, but I don't think that Greco-ontological thought is ashamed of the cadavers, that is to say, the auxiliary sciences. It thinks they're good. That's why it creates them. What it's ashamed of and what it's hiding is that despite its best efforts, these auxiliary sciences are dead. They don't capture man, they capture androids, anthropoids, zombies and vampires, but they don't capture man. So that's the the shameful part. That they exist for Greco-ontological thought is okay. For Laruelle, it's not okay. They shouldn't even be there. But that one might discover that their cadavers, that they're dead, is something to be ashamed of and avoided at all costs. So Greco-ontological thought with these annex auxiliary sciences, bastard sciences, because why are they bastard? Laruelle is a very polite guy. He's not going to say bastard in a simple derogatory sense. They're bastard, and he's going to explain it a little later with the anthropo-logical difference. They're bastard because they're combining, as we said last time, a bric-a-brac of anthropological prejudices and a certain type of formalization that can go up to full mathematization, but even so, it's, as he called it on the preceding page, cheap mathematization. So that's why they're bastard sciences. And he says that this Greco-ontological thought was never able to radically determine any object whatsoever or test what the finite individual is. So we've got the word test, and in the last video I described Laruelle's model as a transcendental, or in my terms metaphysical, research program which has both ideal, non-testable, but properly ideal on the transcendental plane, and so non-testable and testable elements. So he's refusing as non-pertinent the empiricity of the human sciences. So in fact he's refusing experience as we ordinarily think of it. Our experience is not a good guide. Yet at the same time there is something in our experience which is transcendental, and that's the test of what he's saying, of the validity of what he's saying, and of the direction to go to continue what he is saying. So the idea of noesis, of thinking, is very much in line with what Carl Jung says about the dream. He says not to interpret the dream, but to dream the dream onwards. So we're not to interpret his book and his thinking in the book, we're to think the thinking onwards. So there is a test, and the test is the finite individual. I'll be talking about this little later, in a later video. It's something I left unsaid when I was talking about the first page, this word finite. On page 1 he says, ordinary man, the finite individual, whom we also call minorities. So why is the ordinary man finite if the ordinary man is potentially thinkable as coextensive with the transcendental field, or is at least a transcendental region of, for the moment, we haven't defined its extent? Why must it be finite? If we make the comparison with Badiou, Badiou could subscribe to virtually all of this that Laruelle says, but he would not be willing to accept this emphasis on the finitude of the real, because the ordinary man is the real, with a capital R for Laruelle. So for the moment, we don't have a full justification or even a sense of the meaning of finite here. So there may be a way of reconciling Laruelle and Badiou on this point, but for the moment, we're obliged to note a divergence. Another thing that it might be the right place to bring up is that back to page 1 again, ordinary man, the finite individual, whom we also call minorities. So the individual, singular, is minorities, plural. Another term he uses is dispersions. So I would argue, and this poses maybe a problem for the idea that man is completely coextensive, exhaustively coextensive with the transcendental field. Maybe it poses a problem or not. That for Laruelle, because the individual is minorities, minorities of what? Of individuals. So it's minorities of minorities of minorities all the way down, multiplicities of multiplicities of multiplicities all the way down, or dispersions of dispersions of dispersions all the way down. So that, in a way, is Laruelle already foreseeing Badiou's being an event. So when did being an event come out? I think in 1988. So this came out in 1985. This is the problem with translation. You're getting the books translated in the wrong order. So no wonder we can be confused. But Laruelle is foreseeing this notion of, which is necessary, which is a normal, if you want, if you're a good philosopher, a normal extrapolation of what Deleuze and Guattari were on about. And at the same time, as we shall see from this passage, he's foreseeing the danger of encapsulating that dispersion of dispersions within a mathematical framework. So it's probably not nice to say directly to Badiou that it's cheap mathematization, given how much work he's actually done on the mathematics. But a nicer way of saying it is that it's not breaking away. Badiou's project to be published 2 or 3 years later is not breaking away completely enough from the ongoing hallucination of Greco-ontological thought. And we'll see what Laruelle thinks is the defining feature of that thought, and then maybe we'll see how that feeds into a zone of agreement and a zone of disagreement with Badiou. So he actually says the word test, faire l'épreuve in French. So we're getting this idea that it's an ongoing, Laruelle's science, rigorous science of ordinary man, is an ongoing research program, and while it refuses to be an empirical science, it's testable in terms of, as he says in the forward, the order of experiences. It's not empirical because the empirical is not just experiences, it's a bric-a-brac. I'm trying to use this word every day in English, and I would ask you to use the word bric-a-brac at least once a day in ordinary conversation for a week to try and make the word exist a little more strongly in English. So anyhow, for Laruelle, bric-a-brac, well, the empirical data, empirical experience is a is a bric-a-brac. So it's a disorder, as we said, a disordered mixture. So if the human sciences got it together enough to lay out a rigorous, or what it thinks is rigorous, study of man, a disciplined study of man or humans in the same order as the order of experience, that's not enough, because the order of empirical experience is still a disorder for Laruelle. That's why he can say in the foreword that the order of the theorems in this book and of the theorems and the explanations is the same as the necessary order of experience. So this is the necessary order of transcendental experience as it unfolds itself over non-transcendental chronological time. So the problem with Greco-ontological thought is that it leaves indeterminate in its meaning and truth not just the cogito, which is one of its basic concepts. So Laruelle is saying that even for its key concepts, its foundational concepts, that it wants to talk about a use as a foundation, as a basis, the incoherence and the inconsequence of Greco-philosophical thought is such that it leaves the cogito itself and other key concepts indeterminate in its meaning and truth, but also, and as he says more profoundly, it leaves indeterminate the non-anthropo-logical essence of man. Well, it leaves it indeterminate because it can't even talk about it, can't even see it. We're stuck in anthropology and formalization in the human sciences and in our own lives and thoughts about ourselves. We're stuck in anthropology and formalization, and we can't even see or conceive of, without a little help from Laruelle, we can't even conceive of the non-anthropological essence of man. So precisely because it can be an anthropology philosophy as such, philosophy such as it is, does not know man. So because philosophy can be an anthropology, it can be a science of history, it can be linguistics, it can be psychology and sociology, all those things, it's because that it can be those things, and the overarching category here for the moment is anthropology. It can't see man, it can't know man, it can't know the human, and it can't be human itself. Philosophy only knows the inhuman, and it's never able to get at just the human as a term. It's always about the subhuman, the overhuman, the all too human, and so on, but never just the human by itself. And why can't it? Well, he's given lots of reasons, but it conflates ordinary man with any given man. That's okay as a translation, but it's not. Of course, there's this notion of given in it, but that's not in the original French. The original French is elle confond, elle, that is to say, philosophy. Elle confond l'homme ordinaire avec l'homme quelconque. It confounds or conflates ordinary man with l'homme quelconque, his everyday man, the man or the woman in the street, the man or the woman that is without any particular special properties, just anyone that you could observe or run into or encounter or contact. That's not the ordinary man. That's what the human sciences, with their polls and surveys and studies and inquiries and their interviews, tries to get at, but it just gets at the everyday human and not the ordinary man or the ordinary human. So Laruelle says that because of this, the ideal exemplar of the everyday man, whether we know it or not, is the philosopher. So people are often anti-intellectual, anti-philosophical, but that doesn't change anything. We're all in the world regimented by Greco-philosophical anthropo-logical predicates. So that's why we can identify with a minority with a universal predicate that allows us to decide who's in, who's out. So this is what he says when he says, the essence of the individual has remained unthought by philosophy, which merely posits it and puts forward a possible, presumed man, while denying the conditions of its real experience through the multiplicity of authoritarian universals that it uses to filter him. So we're talking about universals, but they're not universal universals. They're not democratic universals. They're demarcational universals. They're universals created and used for demarcation and filtering. Who's in, who's out. What is included under this universal and what is not and must be included under another universal. Multiplying the authoritarian universals until you cover everyone. So this word which he uses, the philosopher requisitions man for his own goals and his own values, which are very specific and need the cover of the universal. So this is a point where Laruelle harks back to Heidegger and projects forward to not the Badiou of being in time, but to the Badiou of, if you want to call it being in time 3, but the Badiou of The Immanence of Truths, which was published 4 years ago, recently, and it's going to come out in English next year. So one of the key ideas of Badiou is that we are in a world, a system of thought and action and governance and so on, where everything is covered over by universal predicates. So this covering over on one definition of the infinite can be infinite itself. But there is a second definition of the finite and the infinite that I don't think Laruelle takes into account in this book, and I don't know if I'll do all his books or in video readings, but we'll see maybe as I branch out at some time whether he explicitly or implicitly makes use of the infinite in a sense closer to Badiou's. It'll never be exactly the same because Badiou filters everything through his mathematical formalization. But we've got a sort of brute concept of the finite for the moment. And we've got this covering over of man, real man, by authoritarian universals that are based on filtering and demarcation. So to keep track of this paragraph, he says at the beginning on page 4 of this paragraph, as concerns man, the concept the sciences have of him is doubly indeterminate. So he's going to give the first indetermination he's going to give the first indetermination through all the paragraph on this page and most of the rest of the paragraph on this page, except for at the end when he comes to the second indetermination. So that's the structure of the paragraph. Okay, initially, so first sense of indetermination, man is a concept indeterminate in its origin and in the Greco-unitary philosophical presuppositions that serve as its foundation. So that's what we've just discussed. The second indeterminacy or indetermination, man remains indeterminate a second time because the sciences of man, unable to reach the height of traditional philosophy, only bring out its theoretical carelessness and its lack of humanity. Okay, I want to disagree with the word bring out there. In French, it's accentuer. Ne font qu'accentuer son laisser-aller théorique. So we talked about theoretical carelessness as being also just letting oneself go with the flow of what everyone thinks or what has always been thought and said over whatever long period of time you want, up to the 2,500 years hallucination of Greco-ontological philosophy. But bring out should probably have been translated just as accentuate. So bring out for me suggests highlight, make it clearer, more evident. But the sciences of man don't just make it more clear, make it clearer for us, it must be said, because for the people who are practicing from it and benefiting from it or being its object, it doesn't bring out for them the theoretical rigor. It accentuates, that is, it goes even further in its in what is philosophy's carelessness and lack of humanity. The human sciences are descending even further or performing even more strongly in the sense of theoretical carelessness and a lack of humanity. So Laruelle then goes on to do, as every self-respecting contemporary French philosopher must do, he's criticizing the cogito and all the other unitary figures of the subject and of man, and he says they remain unclarified in essence. That's what we just said in the first part of this paragraph about the double indetermination. The cogito, he says on page 4, is indeterminate, because philosophy can't determine it. It makes great use of it. It makes it, for a long time anyhow, it makes it its foundation. It may even be found in philosophies that seemingly or supposedly break with the cogito, but it still remains indeterminate, unclarified in its essence, like other concepts, because they are all, without exception, based on, I would like to put a "the," which is not in the text, on the anthropological parallelism or the anthropological philosophical difference. So he's going to go into a development about the anthropological difference on the analogy of the ontological difference in Heidegger. So this thing, anthropological or the anthropological difference, that he hasn't fully defined yet, he says that's what prevents philosophy and human sciences from seeing man at all, and makes them put a substitute concept that it thinks is man but is really an android, an anthropoid, a zombie or a vampire or whatever. So the anthropological difference, I'm putting the, as long as I remember before, anthropological difference, prohibits beginning with man and his solitude. It excludes man. As man in the real sense will exclude anthropological difference. So the anthropological difference begins from a mixture or universal. Man as language, as desire, as society, as power, as sex, etc. Okay, and it puts puppets, philosophical puppets, in its place that we'll call androids, and of which the cogito is one, androids and anthropoids and so on. So I think this is another point of convergence with Badiou in his Logics of Worlds, where when in the introduction Badiou says, what is our contemporary ideology? What am I, or what are us, if I, Badiou, and if all of us, just let ourselves go and say what is real? Will, according to Badiou, find, whether we're explicitly aware of it or not, that what is real is bodies and languages. So bodies is the anthropo side, languages is the logical side. So anthropological difference corresponds to bodies and languages in Badiou, and he adds that everything is bodies and languages except that there are truths. That is to say, there are transcendental truths that cannot be reduced just to science. For Badiou, here would be a difference. For him, truths concern science, poetry, love, and politics. But it may be that Laruelle will be willing to accept all that and include it under the complete notion of what he means by science. So science for Laruelle, transcendental science, is not just what Badiou means by science, but it would include the four truth conditions. That's a sort of jerry-rigged bridge between the two paradigms, but it leaves us room for movement and for being at least a little fluid, because we're not going to be Badiou bashers just because we're Laruellians. That's the empirical. We would be anthropoids there if we did that. So he talks about these fictional beings, like the cogito, ens creatum, spirit, the I think. That's pretty handy. You can say the cogito and the I think, which mean the same thing. The worker, the unconscious. These are fictional beings responsible for populating the desert of anthropo-logical screens, shadows projected on the steep walls of ideas, inhabitants of ideal caves. So, insofar as we're not uh, noetizing, we're still in the cavern. Even our ideas with a capital I are not taking us out of the cavern. So we're not yet human. One interesting uh, consequence of this is we said on page 3 that Laruelle was basically accusing Foucault of being backward looking, that